I should have trusted my instincts the moment she placed the plate in front of me. The dining room shimmered under the golden chandelier, the long mahogany table decorated with elegant porcelain dishes and crystal glasses filled with aged wine. My mother-in-law, Eleanor, sat at the head, her expression unreadable as she gestured toward my plate with a slight, expectant smile. "This," she announced, "is a recipe I learned from a Michelin star chef. Something special just for you." The words should have felt like an honor, a rare olive branch extended from a woman who had never truly accepted me into her perfect, curated world. But instead they sent a strange shiver down my spine. "Before we begin, I just want to say thank you for being part of this journey. If you love stories filled with power plays, deception, and unexpected twists, consider subscribing. It's completely free and helps us keep bringing you more thrilling tales. Now let's dive in." The salad in front of me looked beautiful. Too beautiful. The crisp romaine leaves glistened under the soft glow of the chandelier, sprinkled with slivered almonds, pomegranate seeds, and a delicate drizzle of dressing that smelled off. It wasn't rotten, nor was it entirely unpleasant. But there was something subtly chemical, a sharp undercurrent beneath the usual tang of vinaigrette. I forced a smile, lifting my fork with calculated nonchalance. Across from me, my sister-in-law, Vivian, was already halfway through her plate, oblivious to the quiet storm brewing inside my mind. Vivian, the golden child, the family's pride, forever in competition with me even when I never played her game. "Try it," Eleanor coaxed, her voice silky, almost indulgent. "I had you in mind while making it." I hesitated just long enough for my husband, Daniel, to glance at me. He was only partially paying attention, too absorbed in a discussion with his father about work. Typical. He never noticed the subtle wars waged between the women in his life. I twirled a forkful of salad, pretending to examine it as though admiring the effort. "Looks delicious," I murmured, bringing it closer to my lips but never quite letting it touch. The scent intensified. My stomach twisted. I needed to think fast. Vivian, ever the show-off, had already finished her portion. She wiped her mouth delicately with a linen napkin, smiling smugly as if proving yet again how she could outshine me in every little thing. My gaze flicked to my plate, then to hers. And in that split second an idea formed. I set my fork down deliberately, pretending to adjust my napkin. As I shifted in my chair, I nudged my plate slightly forward, just enough for Vivian's to take its place when I moved my hand next. My fingers brushed against the cool porcelain, and with a subtle flick of my wrist, the plates exchanged positions under the cover of casual movement. Vivian barely noticed. She was too busy gloating over some recent work achievement, basking in our father-in-law's praise. My mother-in-law, however, noticed everything. I saw the way her eyes flickered, just a fraction of a second too long on my plate. I met her gaze and smiled, mirroring her earlier expression of unreadable warmth. Then slowly I lifted my fork again and took a bite. Of the salad Vivian had originally been served. Eleanor's expression shifted just slightly before she regained her usual composure. But something had changed. She was watching too closely now. Vivian, on the other hand, had already picked up my former plate. Without hesitation, she stabbed a forkful of greens and shoved it into her mouth, too wrapped up in her own world to sense the underlying tension. And then I waited. The conversation carried on around us. The clinking of glasses, the occasional burst of laughter. Eleanor had resumed chatting with my father-in-law, though I noticed she barely touched her food. She kept stealing glances at Vivian, waiting. That's when I knew for sure. It was subtle at first, just a shift in Vivian's posture, a slight furrow in her brow. She took another bite, chewed, swallowed. Then she blinked a few times as if something felt. Minutes passed. My stomach churned, but not from what I'd eaten. From anticipation. From the realization that I had been right all along. Vivian coughed once, clearing her throat. Then again more forcefully. Daniel turned to her, wildly concerned. "You okay?" She nodded quickly. "Yeah. Just dry spices or something." But there was a tightness in her voice, something unnatural. Her hands trembled slightly as she reached for her water. Eleanor's fingers curled around her wine glass, grip tightening. "Are you sure, dear? You look a little pale." And there was the confirmation I needed. Something was wrong with that salad. Something meant for me. Vivian shook her head, but I could see the change spreading. Her breathing grew heavier, her movements slower. She swallowed hard, shifting uncomfortably in her seat. The once effortless smugness had drained from her face, replaced by unease. And still Eleanor said nothing. She simply watched. I pressed my napkin to my lips, suppressing a smirk. I should have felt guilty. But I didn't. Not even a little. Because now Eleanor didn't just have to deal with her failed attempt at whatever she had planned for me. Now she had to face the consequences of her actions. Except those consequences had landed squarely on her favored daughter instead. Daniel finally noticed something was off. Viv, you don't look great. I'm fine, she snapped, but the edge in her voice was cracking. Beads of sweat formed along her hairline. Then her face twisted. A sharp intake of breath. Her hand shot to her stomach. And then the inevitable. She shoved back from the table, chair scraping against the hardwood floor, and bolted from the room. Silence fell, broken only by the faint sound of distant retching. I took a slow sip of water, meeting Eleanor's gaze across the table. For the first time ever she looked truly rattled. I smiled sweetly. Delicious salad. Really? You must share the recipe. Eleanor said nothing. But I could see it in her eyes. He knew. And I knew. The game had changed. The silence that followed was suffocating. The once lively dining room, filled with the clinking of cutlery and the soft hum of polite conversation, now felt like the eye of a brewing storm. The echoes of Vivian's rushed footsteps and the distant sounds from the guest bathroom lingered in the air, heavy with unspoken truths. Eleanor hadn't moved. She remained seated at the head of the table, her fingers wrapped around the stem of her untouched wine glass. Her expression was unreadable, but I knew better than to mistake her silence for indifference. She was calculating, piecing together the events that had unfolded, how things had gone so terribly wrong. Daniel had pushed his chair back slightly, half risen, torn between going after his sister and staying put. Should I? No, Eleanor cut in, her voice smooth but carrying an underlying tension. She'll be fine. Let her compose herself. That was when I knew. She wasn't surprised. She wasn't concerned. He was trying to regain control. My fingers traced the rim of my water glass, my heart thudding with a slow, steady rhythm. I wasn't sure what I had expected, but part of me had anticipated more of a reaction. Panic. Denial. A flurry of false concern. Instead, she was trying to will the situation into submission, pretending this wasn't a direct consequence of something she had orchestrated. Daniel frowned, uneasy. She didn't even drink that much. What could have? Maybe something didn't sit well with her. My voice was smooth, casual. That happens sometimes. Eleanor's gaze flicked to mine. Just a brief moment, but enough. Enough to tell me that she knew exactly what had happened. And she knew I knew. A quiet war had begun. Across the table, my father-in-law, Charles, cleared his throat. He had the same unreadable look as Eleanor but lacked the same finesse in controlling it. His discomfort was evident in the way he tapped his fingers against the table, his gaze shifting between us. He hadn't said much all evening, but now he studied me with quiet scrutiny, as if trying to determine whether I had played a role in what had just happened. The weight of his stare didn't bother me. Not anymore. Daniel exhaled, rubbing his temples. I should check on her. He pushed his chair back fully this time and walked toward the hallway, his steps quick but hesitant, as if bracing himself for what he might find. The moment he disappeared, Eleanor finally placed her wine glass down. The sound was deliberate, a quiet command that demanded my attention. Her lips curved into a small, controlled smile. You enjoyed the salad? My stomach twisted, but I forced myself to match her energy, to play along in this new, unspoken game. I leaned back slightly, fingers laced together, and nodded. Absolutely. You really must share the recipe. Pause. A beat too long. Then a slow, amused chuckle. I thought you'd like it, she murmured, swirling the remaining wine in her glass. It's special. Charles stiffened beside her, shooting her a sharp glance. That was interesting. So he knew. Not all of it perhaps, but enough to sense when Eleanor was playing a dangerous game. I tilted my head slightly, feigning curiosity. It had an interesting aftertaste. A little different than I'm used to. Her fingers drummed lightly against the table. New ingredients. Sometimes when you try something unfamiliar, your body reacts in unexpected ways. I wasn't sure if she meant that as a warning or an excuse, but either way, it confirmed everything I had suspected. Before I could respond, a sharp noise echoed from the hallway. The sound of a door swinging open, followed by the unmistakable sound of Vivian's voice, thick with distress. What was in that food? Her voice trembled with frustration, raw and breathless. A few seconds later she appeared at the entrance of the dining room looking pale, shaken. Her makeup had started to smear slightly, and she gripped the doorway like she needed the support. All eyes turned to her. I remained still, unreadable. Eleanor, however, had already put on a mask of feigned concern. "Vivian dear," she said smoothly, rising from her seat. "Are you all right?" Vivian's eyes narrowed, darting between us. "I don't know. But something wasn't right. I felt strange." She exhaled shakily. "It wasn't just a stomachache. Felt like something was messing with my system. My heart was racing. My hands went numb." A thick silence settled over the room. I let the moment stretch, let the weight of her words linger. Then I looked at Eleanor. And waited. For the briefest second, something flickered across her expression. Something dangerously close to irritation. But she recovered too quickly, stepping forward with well-practiced grace, voice laced with the perfect amount of gentle concern. "I can't imagine what could have caused that." She placed a hand on Vivian's arm, the gesture too rehearsed to be comforting. "Maybe an allergic reaction?" Vivian shook her head. "I don't have allergies." "Well," Charles interjected, voice firmer now, more authoritative, "perhaps it's best we have someone look at you just in case." Vivian hesitated, and for a moment I thought she might let it go. She had spent her entire life trusting her mother without question. Even now, despite everything, she wanted to believe there was a reasonable explanation. But something about tonight had shifted. Something in her gut was telling her that she had been used. The realization was slow, creeping, but it was there. She turned to me suddenly, her sharp eyes locking onto mine. "Did you feel anything?" I held her gaze. And then I smiled. "No," I said softly. "I feel perfectly fine." The room tensed. Eleanor's nails pressed into the fabric of her dress. Charles shifted uncomfortably. Vivian's lips parted slightly as if just beginning to understand. Eleanor spoke before she could finish the thought. "Darling, you need to rest. Perhaps a little fresh air would help." The urgency in her tone was subtle but present. She needed Vivian away from this conversation before the pieces fully connected. Daniel returned then, stepping back into the room. His eyes immediately found his sister, concern still evident on his face. "Are you okay?" Vivian hesitated, glancing at me again. Then slowly she nodded. "Yeah. I think I just need a moment." Daniel sighed in relief, wrapping an arm around her shoulder. "Come on, let's get you some water." As they exited, I turned back to Eleanor, whose carefully composed expression had hardened just slightly at the edges. She exhaled softly, shaking her head with a wry smile. "You're smarter than I gave you credit for." I tilted my head, feigning innocence. "I have no idea what you mean." Charles stood abruptly. "Eleanor, a word." She sighed, rubbing her temple, but followed him toward the hallway without another glance in my direction. As soon as they disappeared, I picked up my napkin, dabbing at my lips. The battle lines had been drawn. And Eleanor knew she had lost the first round. The moment Eleanor and Charles disappeared down the hallway, the air in the dining room shifted. It was subtle, almost imperceptible, but I felt it. The lingering tension of a battlefield right after the first shot had been fired. I glanced at the doorway where they had vanished, my fingers tapping lightly against the polished wood of the table. I could hear their voices in the distance, hushed but heated. Charles wasn't pleased. That much was clear. Good. A part of me wanted to follow, to press my ear against the wall and hear the inevitable fallout. But I had played my part well tonight. Now it was time to let the consequences unfold naturally. I turned my gaze toward the last person still at the table, Daniel. He was still standing by the hallway, his hands on his hips, his brow furrowed in thought. He had been quiet for too long, letting everyone else speak, watching instead of acting. But now as his gaze flickered to me, I saw something new. Suspicion. "That was strange," he said finally, his voice low. I raised an eyebrow, feigning innocence. "What was?" He exhaled, shaking his head. "Vivian. The way she reacted." I shrugged, leaning back in my chair. Maybe she really did have a bad reaction to something. It happens. His jaw tightened. "But you ate the same thing." A small smile tugged at the corner of my lips. "Did I?" His eyes narrowed just slightly. He wasn't stupid. No, Daniel was many things, passive, oblivious at times, but not stupid. The problem was he had spent his entire life trusting his mother, never questioning her motives. And now that blind trust was being tested in a way he wasn't ready for. I watched as he tried to make sense of it all, as the pieces tried to click into place. But he hesitated. Because if he admitted something was wrong, then he had to accept the possibility that his mother wasn't the person he had always believed her to be. And that was too much for him to process. So instead he ran a hand through his hair, sighing. I should check on Viv. I nodded, watching as he walked away, disappearing down the same hallway where Eleanor and Charles had gone moments earlier. And just like that, I was alone. For the first time that evening, I let my shoulders relax, my mask slipping just slightly. The adrenaline was still there, humming beneath my skin, but I had won this round. Still, I knew better than to celebrate too soon. Because Eleanor wasn't the type to let a loss go unanswered. I reached for my glass of water, taking a slow sip, when a movement at the edge of my vision caught my attention. A maid. Quiet, unassuming, clearing the table with practiced efficiency. She had been invisible all evening, blending into the background as Eleanor's household staff always did. But now, as she gathered the plates, I noticed something strange. She wasn't just clearing them. She was inspecting them. My breath stilled. She picked up the plate that had originally been meant for me, the one Vivian had eaten from, and examined it closely, her eyes sharp. Then, as if sensing my gaze, she glanced up, meeting my eyes for the briefest second before quickly looking away. Interesting. I set my glass down, smoothing out my dress as I stood. I made my way toward her slowly, deliberately. She stiffened as I approached, keeping her head slightly lowered, her movements just a little too cautious. When I stopped beside her, I spoke softly. "Did you notice something?" She hesitated. A pause so brief that most people wouldn't have caught it. But I did. Then, without looking up, she murmured, "I only do as I'm told, ma'am." The response was safe. Careful. But it wasn't a denial. I studied her for a moment longer before giving her a small nod. Of course. Then, without another word, I turned and left the dining room, heading toward the hallway where the rest of the family had disappeared. I wasn't done playing this game yet. As I walked past the grand staircase, I could hear Eleanor's voice, sharp and clipped. "Should have been careful. You're getting reckless." "Me?" Charles sounded exasperated. "You were the one who insisted on it tonight. What were you thinking?" "I was thinking," she hissed, "that she needs to understand her place." I stopped just before the doorway, hidden from view, my pulse quickening. Charles sighed. "And what place is that, Eleanor? She's Daniel's wife now. You can't keep treating her like..." "Like what?" she snapped. "Like an outsider? Because that's what she is." My fingers curled into my palm. Charles hesitated. "Eleanor, we agreed." "No," she cut in, her voice colder now. "You agreed." "I never did. I will not sit by and watch some girl come in and dismantle everything we built. Not after everything we sacrificed." Silence. Then Charles spoke lower this time. "You need to be careful. She's not as naive as you think." Eleanor scoffed. "She's predictable. She's emotional. She'll slip up sooner or later." I smiled. "Eleanor, you have no idea." I took a step forward, deliberately making my presence known this time. The moment I turned the corner, Eleanor's expression shifted instantly, morphing into something neutral, almost pleasant. "Ah, dear," she said smoothly. "I was just about to come find you." I smiled back, tilting my head slightly. "Oh, something you wanted to discuss?" She studied me for a moment, then let out a soft chuckle. "You're sharper than I gave you credit for." I took a step closer. "And you're more predictable than I thought." Her smile twitched. Charles glanced between us, looking exhausted. "Enough. Whatever this is, it ends tonight." Eleanor didn't look at him. She was too busy watching me now, her gaze calculating. "You think you've won something," she murmured. "But this isn't over." I met her gaze without flinching. "I know. And that was the truth. Because for all the satisfaction I had gained tonight, I knew one thing for certain. Eleanor wasn't done playing. And neither was I." Eleanor's words echoed in my mind long after I left the hallway. "This isn't over." I knew she meant it. This wasn't just a petty grudge anymore. It was a silent war, one that would be fought with whispers, careful manipulation, and quiet schemes. The kind of battle where moves weren't made in the open but in the shadows, where the real damage came from what was unseen. I had expected resistance from her since the moment I married Daniel, but I had underestimated just how deeply rooted her need for control was. Tonight had proven that she wasn't just passive-aggressive, she was willing to cross lines to test boundaries. And that meant I had to be smarter, sharper. When I stepped back into the dining room, the table had already been cleared, the once grand setting now an empty reminder of the battle fought over dinner. The maid from earlier was still there, wiping down the polished surface, her movements careful, precise. I approached her, lowering my voice just enough so that it wouldn't carry. "You noticed something earlier?" She hesitated, fingers tightening around the cloth she held. Her eyes flickered toward the doorway where Eleanor had vanished, then back to me. "I shouldn't speak on things that aren't my place, ma'am." I gave her a small smile, one that wasn't demanding but understanding. "I think we both know that's not entirely true." She glanced around once more before exhaling softly. "The plate." My chest tightened. "What about it?" She hesitated, then sighed. "It was prepared separately. Different from the others. The dressing smelled stronger." Her voice dropped lower. "And she watched you too closely when you took your first bite." I already knew this, but hearing it confirmed from an outside perspective made it more real. More dangerous. "Have you seen her do this before?" I asked. She shook her head. "Not exactly. But there have been instances. People getting sick after meals, usually those she disapproves of." She swallowed hard. "No one ever says anything. It's always written off as coincidence." Coincidence. Right. That was exactly what she had wanted tonight to be. An unfortunate accident, a simple case of bad food. But now she had lost control of the narrative. Because instead of me being the one affected, it was her own daughter. I gave the maid a grateful nod. "Thank you for telling me." She hesitated once more before stepping closer, lowering her voice to just above a whisper. "Be careful, ma'am. She doesn't like to lose. Neither do I." I turned to leave, but just as I reached the doorway, I heard a familiar voice behind me. "You always were good at making friends." I didn't flinch, but I did pause just long enough to let the tension settle before turning. Vivian stood in the doorway, arms crossed, her expression unreadable. She looked better now, less shaken, more composed, but there was still a sharpness in her eyes, something that hadn't been there before. "Feeling better?" I asked lightly. She tilted her head slightly. "Funny thing about that." She took a slow step forward. "I spent the last 30 minutes thinking about what happened. And the more I thought about it, the less sense it made." I said nothing, waiting. She exhaled, shaking her head. "I was fine before dinner. No signs of anything. And then suddenly, halfway through my plate, my body started reacting as if I had eaten something I shouldn't have." I let my expression remain neutral. "That does sound strange." Her lips pressed together. "It does." Then she narrowed her eyes. "Especially since you were the one who was supposed to have that plate." I smiled, slow and knowing. "And yet here we are." Her jaw tightened. "Did you know?" I tilted my head slightly. "What do you think?" She let out a sharp exhale, dragging a hand through her hair. "I don't know what to think." Her voice wasn't just frustrated now, it was uncertain. Because for the first time in her life, she was forced to question something she had never doubted before. Her mother. Vivian had spent years believing she was Eleanor's favorite, the golden child, untouchable. But now that image was cracking and she was trying to piece together the truth. And I could use that. I stepped closer, keeping my voice soft. "You've always thought of me as an outsider, someone trying to take what's yours. But tonight you weren't the exception. You were a pawn." Her throat bobbed as she swallowed. "I don't." I leaned in slightly. "Ask yourself this. If I hadn't switched the plates, do you really think your mother would have stopped it?" Her breath hitched. Because we both knew the answer. She took a step back, shaking her head. "I need to think." I nodded. "Take your time." She turned abruptly and left, her footsteps quick, uneven. I watched her go, knowing that the seed had been planted. Eleanor wanted to play games? Fine. She just didn't realize that I was already 3 moves ahead. As I stepped out of the dining room, I nearly collided with Daniel. His expression was unreadable, but I could tell he had been listening. "Interesting conversation," he said. I raised an eyebrow. "Eavesdropping, are we?" He ignored the jab. "What's your goal here?" I studied him for a moment before speaking. "My goal? To survive in a house where your mother is trying to remove me piece by piece." His jaw clenched. She wouldn't. Wouldn't she? I cut in. You saw what happened tonight. Do you honestly believe that was an accident? He hesitated. And that hesitation told me everything I needed to know. Because deep down he knew. He had always known. He just never wanted to admit it. I sighed, softening my tone. Daniel, I'm not asking you to pick a side. But I am asking you to open your eyes. He exhaled, rubbing his forehead. I need time to process this. I nodded. Take all the time you need. But time was a luxury we didn't have. Because I had no doubt that, right now, Eleanor was already planning her next move. And this time she wouldn't make the same mistake twice. Daniel's footsteps faded down the hall, his mind undoubtedly spinning with conflicting loyalties. I knew he wouldn't confront his mother. Not yet. He needed time to process what he had heard, to decide whether the truth was something he was ready to acknowledge. That was fine. I could afford to be patient. Eleanor, on the other hand, couldn't. I turned back toward the dining room, taking a slow, deliberate breath. The air still carried the faint traces of the evening's tension, but beneath it there was something else. A shift. A fracture in the foundation Eleanor had built so meticulously. And cracks, when widened just right, had the power to bring down entire structures. A quiet sound behind me made me turn. The maid from earlier stood at the far side of the room, hands clasped neatly in front of her. She wasn't looking at me, but I knew she was waiting. Watching. She's not done, I murmured, keeping my voice low. The maid hesitated, then nodded. No, ma'am. She never is. I studied her carefully. Her tone was measured, but there was something beneath it. A careful awareness. A knowledge of how things worked in this house, of how dangerous it was to be on the wrong side of Eleanor's games. I stepped closer. You've been here a long time, haven't you? She nodded. Long enough to know when to keep my head down. And long enough to know when something isn't right, I said. Another pause, then a soft sigh. Yes. I leaned in slightly. Then tell me, has she ever lost before? The maid's lips pressed together as if debating whether she should answer. But then in the softest whisper she said, not like this. A chill ran through me. Because if Eleanor had never been beaten at her own game before, that meant she wouldn't retreat now. She would retaliate. And this time she wouldn't just be watching from a distance, she would be coming straight for me. I exhaled slowly. Then I suppose I should prepare. The maid hesitated. Then with a quiet glance toward the hallway she murmured, be careful, ma'am. She doesn't like when things don't go her way. Neither do I. As I made my way upstairs, my mind raced through the possibilities. Eleanor had taken a calculated risk tonight, assuming she could manipulate me into being just another casualty of her control. But she had underestimated one crucial detail. I wasn't afraid of her. She thrived on intimidation, on weaving traps so delicately that people barely realized they had walked into them. But what happened when the prey knew they were being hunted? I stepped into my bedroom, closing the door behind me. The room was dimly lit, the city skyline glowing beyond the large windows. My reflection stared back at me in the glass, calm, composed. But beneath that a fire burned. I needed to be one step ahead. If Eleanor was planning something, I had to make sure she was the one caught in the web, not me. A quiet knock at the door made me turn. Vivian. She stood at the threshold, arms crossed, her face a mask of stubborn defiance. But there was something else there too, uncertainty. I gestured for her to enter. She hesitated, then stepped inside, closing the door behind her. For a moment neither of us spoke. Then she exhaled sharply. I need to know the truth. I folded my arms. Which truth? There are so many to choose from. She shot me a sharp glare. Did you switch the plates on purpose? I held her gaze, letting the silence stretch. Then finally I said, yes. She inhaled sharply, but she didn't look as angry as I expected. Just taken. She paced the room once, then turned back to me. And you think, she swallowed. You think Mom did something to it? I watched her carefully. This was the moment that would decide everything. If she believed me, Eleanor would lose one of her strongest pieces. If she didn't, I would be on my own. So I spoke plainly. I don't think, Vivian. I know. Her face twisted, torn between denial and realization. Why, she whispered. Why would she do that? I sighed. Because she doesn't see me as family. She sees me as an outsider. A threat. And she wanted to remind me of my place. Vivian swallowed hard, shaking her head. That doesn't make sense. She's controlling, yes. She wants things done her way, but she wouldn't. I raised an eyebrow. She faltered. Because deep down she knew. She had seen it before, even if she had never wanted to admit it. The way Eleanor manipulated situations, twisted conversations to suit her needs. The way she always managed to make herself the victim, no matter how many people she stepped on in the process. Vivian collapsed onto the edge of the bed, rubbing her temples. This is insane. I sat beside her. It's reality. She exhaled, shaking her head. What are you going to do? I looked at her carefully. That depends. She frowned. On what? I leaned forward slightly. On whether you want to keep being a pawn in her game, or whether you're ready to start playing for yourself. Vivian's eyes widened slightly. I could see the gears turning in her head. The years of blind loyalty warring with the new, uncomfortable truth settling in her gut. She had spent her whole life in Eleanor's shadow, believing she was untouchable. But now she was starting to see the truth. And the truth was dangerous. Finally, after a long silence, she whispered, "What do you need me to do?" A slow smile spread across my lips. Because now the real game was about to begin. I stood, walking toward the window, staring out at the city below. The lights flickered in the distance, countless stories playing out behind closed doors. But in this house, in this moment, only one story mattered. Eleanor had set the first trap. But now it was my turn to lay one of my own. And this time I wasn't going to miss. Vivian's words lingered in the air, a quiet but powerful declaration. What do you need me to do? It was the moment I had been waiting for. The moment Eleanor's perfect kingdom began to crack from the inside. She had spent years molding her daughter into a mirror of herself. Composed, obedient, untouchable. But now, for the first time, Vivian was looking beyond the carefully constructed reality she had always known. I turned to face her, watching as she toyed with the hem of her sleeve, her nails tapping rhythmically against the fabric. She was nervous. Unsettled. And that was good. Fear made people careful, but doubt made them dangerous. You don't have to do anything, I said, my voice calm. Not yet. She frowned. Then why ask? Because I needed to know if you were ready. Her lips parted as if to protest, but then she hesitated. Finally she exhaled, her shoulders dropping slightly. And what if I am? A slow, knowing smile spread across my face. Then watch, I murmured. And wait. Vivian's hesitation was still there, but the seed had been planted. And that was all I needed. That night, as I lay in bed beside Daniel, I couldn't sleep. His breathing was steady, his arm draped loosely over my waist, but his body was tense even in sleep. I knew his mind was still tangled in the events of the evening, in the slow realization that his mother was not the woman he had always believed her to be. I stared at the ceiling, my thoughts racing. Eleanor was planning her next move. Of that I had no doubt. She had underestimated me once, and that was her mistake. But she wouldn't make the same error twice. No, this time she would come for me directly. And I needed to be ready. The morning came too quickly. The sunlight filtered through the curtains in soft, golden rays, casting patterns on the bedroom walls. I could hear the faint sounds of the house waking up. Distant footsteps, quiet voices, the hum of activity in the kitchen. Daniel stirred beside me, letting out a low sigh. When his eyes blinked open, they were still clouded with sleep. But the moment he saw me watching him, awareness settled in. "You're thinking too much," he murmured. I arched an eyebrow. "Am I?" He exhaled, rubbing a hand over his face. "You're plotting." I smirked. "And you're only realizing this now?" He groaned, rolling onto his back. "I don't know how we got here." I did. We got here because his mother had underestimated the wrong person. I sat up, stretching my arms before glancing down at him. "Are you going to talk to her?" Daniel let out another sigh, staring at the ceiling. "I don't know what to say." "Start with the truth." His jaw tightened. "The truth isn't that simple." I shook my head. "It is. You just don't want to see it." A muscle in his jaw twitched, but he didn't argue. Because deep down he knew I was right. Breakfast was tense. The dining table was set as elaborately as ever, but the air was thick with unspoken words. Eleanor sat at the head of the table, her expression carefully neutral, but I could see the sharpness in her eyes. He was watching. Calculating. Vivian sat across from me, her fork idly poking at her food. She hadn't spoken much since entering the room, and that in itself was unusual. Normally, she would have filled the space with empty conversation, casual boasts about her latest achievements. But today she was quiet. Observing. Good. Daniel sat beside me, stiff and uncomfortable, his fingers wrapped around his coffee cup like it was the only thing grounding him. Charles, as always, remained silent, reading the morning paper as if he wasn't aware of the tension thickening around us. It was Eleanor who finally broke the silence. "I trust everyone slept well?" Her tone was smooth, casual. But the way her gaze lingered on me said everything. I smiled. "Like a dream," she hummed, taking a delicate sip of her tea. "Good. We have a long day ahead." The statement was pointed. A warning. I didn't react. Instead, I leaned forward slightly, my gaze steady. "Vivian, how are you feeling?" Eleanor's hand froze mid-motion just for a fraction of a second. But I caught it. Vivian blinked, glancing at me. "Better," she said cautiously. I nodded. "I was thinking about last night. About how strange it was." Eleanor set her teacup down gently. "Strange." I tilted my head. "Yes. It's just odd, isn't it? How perfectly fine she was before dinner, and then suddenly, I trailed off, letting the words hang." Vivian shifted uncomfortably. Daniel glanced between us, tense. Charles finally lowered his newspaper, watching with quiet interest. Eleanor, to her credit, didn't flinch. "Sometimes the body reacts unexpectedly to certain foods," she said smoothly. I nodded. "That's true. Though it is strange that only one plate seemed to cause an issue." The tension thickened. Vivian swallowed. "It was the salad." Eleanor turned to her, smiling faintly. "Are you sure, dear?" Vivian hesitated. Then slowly she nodded. "Yes." Eleanor's smile remained, but her eyes darkened just slightly. "Perhaps you have an undiscovered sensitivity." I exhaled a soft laugh, shaking my head. "Or maybe it wasn't an accident at all." The air stilled. Daniel tensed beside me. Charles frowned. Vivian's breath hitched. And for the first time, Eleanor's carefully constructed mask slipped. Just for a moment. Just long enough for me to see what lay beneath. Cold calculation. She wasn't afraid. She wasn't guilty. She was just waiting. Waiting to see how far I would go. I leaned back in my chair, smiling sweetly. But of course that would be ridiculous, wouldn't it? After all, we're family. Eleanor's lips curled into something that wasn't quite a smile. "Yes," she murmured. "We are." The game had changed. And the next move was mine. Eleanor's gaze lingered on me, her smile frozen, artificial. The breakfast table remained eerily quiet, the air thick with an unspoken challenge. Everyone had heard my words. And everyone knew they weren't just empty speculation. Vivian shifted uncomfortably in her chair, her fork scratching against the porcelain plate. Charles, as always, remained silent, his expression unreadable. Daniel kept his head down, stirring his coffee, but I could feel the weight of his thoughts pressing against the space between us. He knew something wasn't right. He just wasn't ready to face it yet. Eleanor, however, was never one to sit in silence for too long. She adjusted the napkin on her lap with deliberate ease, as if we were simply discussing the weather. "Of course, dear," she said smoothly. "Family is everything. That's why I always make sure we look after each other." The words were coated in honey, but I tasted the bitterness beneath them. A warning. A promise that she wasn't done yet. I tilted my head, meeting her gaze with feigned innocence. "That's what I love about this family. The way we always take care of things." Eleanor's fingers curled just slightly around the edge of her teacup. The game had shifted. And I wasn't about to back down. Vivian, however, was unraveling. I could see it in the way she kept glancing at Eleanor, her usual confidence crumbling under the weight of her newfound doubt. Last night she had asked me what I needed her to do. Today she was starting to realize that the real question wasn't about what I needed. It was about what she was willing to see. Because the truth was staring her right in the face. And for the first time in her life she wasn't looking away. Eleanor must have sensed it too. She set her cup down carefully, then turned to Vivian with a concerned expression. "Darling, you're awfully quiet this morning. Are you sure you're feeling better?" It was a test. A subtle push to see whether Vivian was still under her control. I held my breath, waiting. Vivian blinked, hesitated. Then slowly she straightened her shoulders. She exhaled, her fingers tightening around her fork. I don't know. Eleanor's smile didn't falter, but something in her eyes darkened. You don't know? Vivian swallowed hard. About last night. About everything. A thick silence followed. The kind that made time feel heavy stretched too thin. Then Eleanor did something I didn't expect. She laughed. It was soft, effortless but forced. A carefully curated sound designed to make Vivian feel ridiculous for even considering doubt. Oh, sweetheart, she said lightly. You're overthinking. It was just a bad reaction to something in the food. It happens. Vivian hesitated. I saw the internal battle play out in real time. The part of her that had always trusted her mother warring with the new, creeping suspicion that maybe, just maybe, that trust had been misplaced. I needed to act. I leaned forward slightly, keeping my voice gentle. Vivian, do you really believe that? Eleanor's gaze snapped to me, sharp as glass. Vivian looked down at her plate. I don't know what to believe anymore. And there was the first domino. Eleanor's fingers twitched just barely, but I saw it. She wasn't used to losing control of the narrative. She turned back to Vivian, her voice a perfect balance of warmth and authority. Sweetheart, you're exhausted. You've been under a lot of stress lately. Maybe that's why you're feeling so unsure. It was a carefully laid trap. Make Vivian doubt herself. Make her believe that her thoughts weren't her own. That she was simply overwhelmed, not seeing things clearly. But this time it didn't work. Vivian exhaled, shaking her head. No. That's not it. Eleanor's mask cracked. Not fully. Not enough for anyone else to notice. But I did. She wasn't just losing control. She was losing her. Charles finally set his newspaper down, clearing his throat. Perhaps we should move on from this topic. It wasn't a suggestion. It was a command. And just like that, the tension shifted again. Eleanor nodded, regaining her composure, and Daniel exhaled in quiet relief. The conversation turned, forced into safer waters, but the damage had already been done. Because Vivian wasn't the same as she had been yesterday. And Eleanor knew it. The rest of breakfast passed in a blur, but my mind never stopped working. I needed to keep this momentum. I needed to make sure that Vivian didn't retreat back into the safety of denial. So after the table was cleared and the family scattered for the day, I followed her. She was outside in the garden, sitting on the stone bench near the fountain, staring at the water with a distant expression. She didn't look up as I approached. I don't know what to do, she admitted softly. I sat beside her, letting the quiet settle. You don't have to do anything yet. She shook her head. That's the problem. I've spent my whole life not doing anything. Just accepting things as they were. I watched her carefully. And now? She let out a breath, her hands clasped together. Now, I'm starting to realize that maybe I should have been paying attention all along. I smiled, slow and knowing. It's never too late. Vivian turned to me then, her expression guarded but determined. You're not scared of her, are you? I met her gaze without hesitation. No. She studied me for a moment, then nodded. I think I want to see what happens when someone finally stands up to her. I smirked. Then stick around. Eleanor had spent years keeping this family in check, making sure no one strayed too far from her control. But now the cracks were forming. And the first domino had already fallen. It was only a matter of time before the rest followed. Vivian sat beside me, staring at the water in the fountain, lost in thoughts she had never allowed herself to have before. The weight of realization was sinking into her, and I could see the way her hands trembled slightly as she processed everything. She had been raised to believe in Eleanor's perfection, molded to reflect her mother's values, taught to admire the control Eleanor wielded so effortlessly. But now that foundation was crumbling beneath her feet. She turned to me suddenly, her voice quiet but firm. She won't let this go. I nodded, already knowing the truth in her words. No, she won't. Eleanor didn't believe in losing. If she sensed even the smallest crack in her carefully built empire, she would do whatever it took to seal it shut before it widened. And right now that crack was Vivian. I watched her carefully, waiting to see what she would do next. This was her moment. She could either retreat, pretend none of this had ever happened, or she could step forward into a battle she had never thought she would have to fight. She exhaled slowly, her fingers tightening in her lap. What if I told her I know? I tilted my head. And what would you say? She hesitated, shaking her head. I don't know. I don't even know what I believe yet. I understood. It was one thing to suspect, to feel the weight of doubt pressing against your chest. It was another thing entirely to say the words out loud, to accept that the person you had trusted your entire life wasn't who you thought they were. I reached out, placing a hand on her arm. Then don't rush. She'll come to you first. Let her show you who she really is. Vivian swallowed hard but nodded. The door behind us creaked open and I already knew who it was before I turned. Eleanor stood in the doorway, framed by the warm glow of the house, her presence casting a long looming shadow over the garden. Her lips curled into a soft smile but her eyes were unreadable. "There you are," she said smoothly, stepping toward us. "I was wondering where you had gone." Her gaze flicked to me first, then to Vivian, assessing, calculating. Vivian sat up straighter, her shoulders tense. "Just getting some air." Eleanor hummed, her expression shifting just slightly. "Good. You had me worried earlier." She reached out, brushing a hand over Vivian's shoulder in an affectionate gesture that felt more like possession than care. "I was thinking we should have a little talk. Just the two of us." Vivian hesitated, and I saw the moment of uncertainty flicker across her face. She wasn't ready. Not yet. Eleanor noticed it too. She smiled gently. "You know you can always talk to me, darling." Vivian inhaled deeply, then nodded. "Okay." I let my hand drop from her arm, giving her a reassuring glance before she stood and followed Eleanor back into the house. I didn't move, didn't call after her. This was her battle now. But I had no doubt that Eleanor was about to remind her just how dangerous it was to doubt the queen. I waited, my fingers tracing patterns on the stone bench, my mind racing through the possibilities. I wanted to believe that Vivian would hold her ground, that she wouldn't fold under the weight of Eleanor's carefully crafted words. But I also knew how powerful Eleanor's influence was. She could weave a story so intricate that even the person experiencing it would begin to question their own reality. Minutes passed. Then an hour. I stood, pacing near the fountain, my ears straining for any sound, any indication of how the conversation was going. But the house was silent. Too silent. When the door finally opened again, I turned quickly, my stomach tightening. Vivian stepped out alone, her face pale, her hands clenched at her sides. I took a cautious step forward. "Vivian." She stopped, exhaling shakily. She knew. A chill ran down my spine. "What do you mean?" She looked up at me, her eyes filled with something that wasn't quite fear but wasn't far from it either. She knew we were talking. She knew I was doubting her. My blood ran cold. Of course she knew. Eleanor was always listening, always watching. There was no such thing as privacy in this house, no conversation that went unheard. She had been waiting for Vivian to slip, to show the first sign of weakness. And now she had. I took another step closer. "What did she say?" Vivian let out a humorless laugh. "That I was being manipulated. That you were the one trying to turn me against her. That you've been planning this from the moment you married Daniel." I clenched my jaw, my heart hammering against my ribs. "And do you believe her?" She hesitated. The silence stretched too long. Then finally she shook her head. "No." But she almost convinced me. That was the terrifying part. Eleanor didn't need the truth to be on her side. She just needed enough doubt to take root. Because once it did, she could twist it, reshape it into something that fit her narrative. I swallowed hard. "What else did she say?" Vivian hesitated again, then sighed. "That I need to be careful who I trust. That she only wants what's best for the family." She looked up, something unreadable flickering in her expression. "And that she's going to fix everything." My stomach twisted. That wasn't a reassurance. That was a threat. Eleanor wasn't just planning to regain control. She was planning to erase any trace that she had ever lost it in the first place. I exhaled slowly, steadying myself. "Then we don't have much time." Vivian frowned. "For what?" I met her gaze, my voice firm. "To make sure she's the one who falls first." She stared at me for a long moment, her breath coming unevenly. Then slowly she nodded. The crack in Eleanor's crown had deepened. And now, all it would take was one final push to bring her empire crumbling down. Vivian's nod solidified something between us. A silent pact. A mutual understanding that we were no longer just reacting to Eleanor's control. We were preparing to dismantle it. But knowing we needed to act was one thing. Deciding how was another. I could see the internal war still raging in Vivian. Her entire life had been shaped by Eleanor's hands. sculpted into the perfect daughter, the loyal pawn. And now she was being asked to betray the woman who had built her. It wasn't an easy thing to undo even when the truth was staring her in the face. I kept my voice steady, careful. If she's planning to fix things, that means she already has something in motion. Vivian exhaled sharply. She does. I stiffened. What is it? She hesitated, rubbing her arms like she was cold. She's going to get rid of you. The words settled in the air like a drop of ink in water, dark and spreading. I had expected as much, but hearing it confirmed sent an electric current of adrenaline through me. I took a slow breath. How? Vivian shook her head. I don't know the details. But she was calm when she said it. Too calm. Like she's already set the pieces in place. That was what made Eleanor dangerous. She never acted impulsively. Every move was calculated, every detail ironed out long before anyone else even realized a game was being played. And if she had reached the stage where she was openly telling Vivian about her plans, it meant she was close to executing them. I swallowed the unease rising in my throat and forced a small, sharp smile. Then we'll just have to act first. Vivian's expression flickered with uncertainty. How? She controls everything. I tilted my head. No, she doesn't. Her brow furrowed. She controls what people see, I clarified. But people like her, they always have secrets. And secrets have a way of unraveling when you pull the right thread. Vivian's lips parted slightly as realization dawned. We weren't going to fight Eleanor head-on. That would be playing into her hands. We were going to let her undo herself. I stepped closer, lowering my voice. I need to know everything. Every little thing she's ever done to keep her grip on this family. Vivian hesitated, biting her lip. That could take days. I gave her a pointed look. We don't have days. Her throat bobbed as she swallowed, then nodded. For the next hour we sat in the garden, piecing together Eleanor's web. It was more intricate than I had expected. Everything she did was strategic. Who she invited into the family, who she kept at a distance, the lies she told to keep control. She had manipulated not just Vivian but Daniel, Charles, even the staff, ensuring that no one questioned her authority. But then Vivian hesitated, her fingers gripping the edge of the bench. There's one thing, but I don't know if it's true. I leaned in slightly. What is it? She looked around like she was afraid the house itself might hear. Dad, she whispered. I frowned. What about him? Vivian hesitated, then spoke so quietly I almost didn't hear. I think she has something on him. Something that keeps him from standing up to her. My pulse quickened. Charles had always been the quiet one, the passive observer. I had assumed it was just his nature, but what if it wasn't? What if Eleanor was holding something over him, something that ensured his silence? I exhaled slowly. If that's true, then that's our thread. Vivian looked at me, uncertainty still lingering. And if it's not? I smiled faintly. Then we find another one. Eleanor thought she was untouchable, but every fortress had a weakness. And I was going to find hers. That night I waited. Dinner had been uneventful. Eleanor was back to playing the gracious matriarch, pretending nothing was wrong. But I could see the tension in her shoulders, the way she glanced at me just a second too long. She was waiting for something. So was I. When the house finally quieted, I slipped out of bed and moved toward the hallway. I needed to talk to Charles. Alone. I found him in his study, nursing a glass of whiskey, his eyes distant as he stared at the fireplace. He didn't look up when I stepped inside, but I knew he had heard me. You should be careful sneaking around at night, he murmured. This house has too many ghosts. I closed the door behind me. Then maybe it's time to let some of them out. That got his attention. He turned, his gaze sharp. What do you want? I stepped forward. The truth. His lips twitched in amusement, but it didn't reach his eyes. That's a dangerous thing to go looking for in this house. I didn't waver. What does she have on you? His jaw tightened. Nothing. I tilted my head. Lying to me doesn't help either of us. A flicker of something passed through his expression. Then he exhaled, swirling the whiskey in his glass. She knows things, he said finally. Things I can't afford to let out. I stepped closer. Like what? He hesitated, then met my gaze. Enough to destroy everything. A chill ran down my spine. Eleanor wasn't just controlling him. She was blackmailing him. I swallowed. Why haven't you fought back? He let out a humorless laugh. Because fighting Eleanor is like trying to fight the tide. No matter how strong you think you are, she always finds a way to pull you under. I studied him for a long moment. He wasn't just defeated. He was resigned. Eleanor had broken him so completely that he no longer believed escape was possible. But I wasn't him. I stepped forward, lowering my voice. What if I told you she's already slipping? Charles's eyes narrowed. What if I told you, I continued, that for the first time she's losing control? His fingers tightened around his glass. Then I'd say you don't know her as well as you think you do. I smiled faintly. Or maybe you don't. A muscle in his jaw twitched, but he didn't respond. I leaned in slightly. You may not be willing to fight her, but I am. And whether you believe it or not, her time is running out. Charles studied me for a long moment. Then finally he sighed. She has records, he muttered. Files. On everyone. My pulse quickened. Where? He hesitated, then murmured, the safe. In her office. Bingo. I stepped back. Thank you. He shook his head, downing the rest of his whiskey. You're playing a dangerous game. I smiled. So is she. Then without another word I turned and left. Because now I had exactly what I needed to bring Eleanor down. The moment I stepped out of Charles's study, the weight of what I had learned settled on me like a storm cloud ready to burst. Eleanor had records, files on everyone. Secrets she had hoarded like a dragon guarding treasure, each one a thread in the web she used to control this family. And now for the first time I knew where to find them. I moved swiftly down the dimly lit hall, my pulse steady despite the rush of adrenaline flooding my veins. The house was eerily quiet, the heavy silence stretching between its grand walls. But I knew better than to believe I was truly alone. Eleanor was always watching, always listening. But tonight she had no idea that I was coming for her first. Vivian was waiting for me in my bedroom, perched on the edge of a chair near the window. She looked up the moment I entered, her expression tight with tension. Well, I shut the door behind me and exhaled. She has a safe. In her office. Vivian stiffened, her eyes widening just slightly. With the records? I nodded. If we can get inside, we'll have everything we need to bring her down. For a moment, neither of us spoke. The magnitude of what we were about to do hung between us, heavy and unspoken. If we did this, there was no turning back. We weren't just resisting Eleanor's control. We were shattering it completely. Vivian swallowed hard. She'll never forgive us. I met her gaze steadily. She was never going to forgive us, Vivian. Not after last night. She exhaled sharply, then nodded. So how do we do this? I glanced at the clock. Eleanor would be in her bedroom by now, likely planning whatever retaliation she had in store. If we were careful, we had time. But not much. We go now, I said. Before she realizes we've moved first. Vivian hesitated for only a second before standing. Okay. We slipped out into the hallway, our steps silent against the polished floors. Every shadow felt like it carried eyes, but I forced myself to stay focused. Eleanor's office was at the end of the east wing, past the main staircase and through a set of grand double doors. I had been inside before, but never alone. Never with the intention of picking apart the life she had built. When we reached the doors, I hesitated, pressing my ear against the wood. Silence. I glanced at Vivian. Watch the hall. She nodded, positioning herself slightly away from the door, eyes scanning for any movement. I took a slow breath, then turned the handle. It opened easily. Of course it did. Eleanor didn't believe she could be challenged. The office was just as I remembered, elegant, pristine, and meticulously arranged. A massive mahogany desk sat in the center, a wall of bookshelves behind it. A painting of Eleanor herself, poised and regal, hung above the fireplace. But my eyes went straight to the corner of the room. It was sleek, built into the wall, hidden behind a decorative panel. I moved quickly, kneeling in front of it. Vivian, I whispered. Come here. She slipped inside, closing the door behind her. Do you know the combination? I gritted my teeth. No. But I have a guess. Eleanor was predictable in her vanity. Everything she did was about control and legacy. If I had to bet, the combination would be tied to something personal. Something important to her. I tried her wedding anniversary first. Nothing. Her birthday. Nothing. I exhaled sharply, thinking. Then my gaze flicked to the painting above the fireplace. Her mother. I punched in the birth year of Eleanor's mother. The safe clicked open. Vivian let out a quiet breath of shock. You're kidding. I smirked. Even Eleanor has weaknesses. Inside there were neatly stacked folders, each labeled with names I recognized. People in the family, business associates, even former friends. She had dirt on everyone. But one file in particular caught my eye. Files. I pulled it out, flipping it open. And what I saw made my stomach drop. Bank records. Offshore accounts. Evidence of financial manipulation dating back decades. Charles wasn't just complicit in Eleanor's control, he was trapped in it. If this information got out, his career, his reputation, everything would be ruined. Vivian peered over my shoulder, her breath hitching. She's been holding this over him for years. I nodded grimly. And I bet he's not the only one. We rifled through more files, scanning pages as quickly as we could. She had covered every angle, every potential threat to her reign. But then I found something even more damning. A contract. One with Daniel's name on it. Vivian frowned. What is that? I scanned the document, my stomach twisting. She's been planning to cut me out legally. Vivian's eyes widened. You mean? She's setting it up so that if Daniel ever sides with me, he loses everything. Vivian took a sharp step back. She's insane. I smiled bitterly. No. She's just terrified. We didn't have time to go through everything, but this was enough. More than enough. I grabbed the most damning files and tucked them under my arm. We need to go. Vivian nodded quickly, but just as we turned, the door creaked open. And Eleanor stood there. She was calm. Too calm. Her eyes flicked to the open safe, then to the files in my hands. And she smiled. I was wondering when you'd finally grow bold enough to try, she murmured. Vivian tensed beside me, her breath shaky. But I held Eleanor's gaze, steady and unflinching. I was just cleaning up, I said lightly. Since you seem to be making a mess of things. Eleanor chuckled, stepping further inside, closing the door behind her. You think you've won something here? I lifted the file. I think I have more than enough to make sure you don't. For the first time, something flickered across her expression. The smallest crack. She exhaled, tilting her head. You don't understand the game you're playing. I stepped forward. Oh, I do. And I just changed the rules. Her lips pressed together, the mask slipping slightly. You think you can break me? I smiled, slow and knowing. No. You're going to do that yourself. The tension in the room was suffocating, the weight of years of manipulation pressing against the walls. But I had the upper hand now. Because Eleanor wasn't in control anymore. I was. And this was the beginning of the end for her.